The music died inside Omar Hassan long before his heart threatened to tear itself apart. A young virtuoso, now a pale, trembling shadow, he lay on the operating table in Sterling Medical Center, his life ebbing away with terrifying speed. Around him, the gleaming theater hummed with a desperate, failing battle. Dr. Mateo Vargas, chief of staff and usually a monolith of confidence, barked orders laced with growing panic. Dr. Akiko Sato, a surgeon of legendary precision, found her expert hands faltering, her brow slick with a terror she rarely knew. Hidden in the periphery, a rookie nurse named Nizhoni stood, a quiet shadow against the brilliant lights, her presence barely registered by the frantic titans. She was merely another face in the scrubbed throng, expected to observe, not contribute. Yet, her dark eyes, ancient and unwavering, saw something beyond the flashing monitors, a subtle shift missed by the panicked elite. A forgotten past stirred within her, a dormant skill that whispered of a different kind of battlefield, a different way to fight for a life. Omar Hassan was fading, but Nizhoni, the quiet observer, was about to show them what they truly hadn't seen coming. Omar Hassan's young life was spiraling, the monitors around him screaming a digital elegy. The rhythm of the operating room, once a precise dance of expertise, had devolved into a frantic, disjointed scramble. The air thickened with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of ozone from overworked machines. Dr. Mateo Vargas, his face now a mask of grim frustration, barked commands that no longer carried their usual authoritative weight. His hands, usually so deft, trembled almost imperceptibly as he rechecked a failing connection. The aortic tear, once a contained tragedy, was now a ravenous beast, devouring Omar from within, defying every standard protocol Vargas threw at it. Beside him, Dr. Akiko Sato, her surgical mask doing little to hide the increasing tension around her eyes, worked with a furious, almost desperate grace. Her brilliance was undeniable, her record impeccable, but this case was proving to be a malignant anomaly. Each adjustment, each meticulously placed stitch, seemed only to delay the inevitable for mere moments. The Sterling Medical Center, a bastion of medical miracles, felt like a sinking ship, and its captain and first mate were running out of options. Nizhoni, tucked back near the instrument tables, felt the familiar prickle of adrenaline, but it was different here. Not the raw, primal fear of a dusty battlefield, but a colder, more insidious dread born of helplessness within a rigid system. She watched Omar, not just the numbers flashing red, but the subtle, almost imperceptible tremors in his fingers, the waxing and waning of a pallor that was deeper, more mottled than the standard signs of hypovolemic shock. It was a detail so minute, so specific, that only someone who had seen the precise moment life bled out in the most brutal, unforgiving ways would recognize it. This wasn't just a rapidly progressing tear, it was a specific, catastrophic phase she had witnessed before, on different bodies, in different, far less sterile environments. A chill went down her spine. The textbooks didn't cover this, but the dirt and blood of a combat zone did. Chief, Nizhoni's voice, a soft murmur barely above the hum of the machines, cut through the tension. It was an impulsive, almost involuntary sound, born of a conviction that was growing with terrifying speed. The peripheral perfusion, Dr. Vargas. And the specific tremor in the extremities. It suggests a unique cavitation. We're losing time with the current approach. Vargas didn't even turn. He scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Nurse, you're a rookie. Observe. This is an aortic dissection, not a street brawl wound. Stick to instruments. His words were like a physical shove, pushing her back into her designated box, her indigenous name a quiet, often mispronounced footnote in the polished halls of Sterling. Sato, however, flicked a glance at Nizhoni, her brow furrowed. Cavitation, nurse? Are you referring to a specific mechanism of injury? This is a spontaneous dissection. You're out of your depth. Her tone was cool, precise, and utterly unyielding, the judgment of an accomplished surgeon on a junior, unproven mind. The hierarchy wasn't just rigid, it was absolute. Doctors decided. Nurses assisted. A rookie nurse certainly did not diagnose or offer unsolicited, unproven theories. A hot flush crawled up Nizhoni's neck, not of shame, but of a fierce, desperate urgency. She felt the weight of Omar's life slipping through their expert fingers, through their rigid adherence to known protocols. The very system designed to save him was blinding them. It's not about the initial injury, doctor. It's the progression. A specific type of tear that, once it hits this stage, creates a localized pressure phenomenon. If we don't address it now, directly, the cascade will be irreversible. Her voice was still quiet, but the underlying steel was unmistakable to anyone who bothered to listen. But no one did. Vargas threw his hands up in exasperation. We're following the protocol, nurse. I am the chief of staff. I have operated on hundreds of these. What you're suggesting is pure conjecture, and frankly, dangerous to patient morale. Get back to your post. Sato simply turned her back, her focus returning to the struggling patient, her dismissive silence more cutting than any words. Nizhoni was just a shadow, a fleeting, impertinent voice in the periphery, easily ignored. But the tremor in Omar's hand, the specific, almost imperceptible discoloration that her experienced eyes saw, pulsed with a truth that no amount of dismissal could erase. The beast in Omar's chest was not responding to their sophisticated attacks because it was a different beast entirely, one she knew intimately from a life she had tried to bury. And it demanded a different kind of fight. The air in the sterile operating room, already taut with the gravity of Omar Hassan's failing heart, grew thick with a sickening dread. Minutes, which felt like an eternity, had bled away since Nizhoni's quiet warning. The monitors, a relentless Greek chorus of disaster, began to shriek. First, a single, insistent beep, then a rapid, accelerating staccato. Omar's blood pressure, already dangerously low, plummeted further, dragging his heart rate down with it like a stone sinking in water. He's crashing. Sato's voice, usually a blade of calm precision, had a jagged edge now. Her usually steady hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly as she fought a losing battle against the cascade of failing systems within Omar's chest. More vasopressors. Increase the fluid bolus. Now. Vargas, sweat beading on his brow, barked orders into the chaos. His earlier dismissiveness had curdled into a desperate, controlled panic. He was operating on autopilot, every fiber of his being focused on the standard protocols drilled into him over decades of elite practice. Yet, the beast he was fighting refused to conform. Omar's dissection, instead of stabilizing under their aggressive, precise interventions, seemed to accelerate, tearing through the fragile tissue of his aorta with renewed, brutal force. The sophisticated repair they had meticulously attempted was failing, and rapidly. Nizhoni watched, her heart a cold, hard knot of terror in her chest. The subtle discoloration on Omar's skin that had caught her eye intensified, blooming into a mottled, purplish hue around his extremities. The tremor in his hand wasn't just a tremor anymore, it was a weak, involuntary spasm, his body's desperate, dying protest. Every instinct honed in the brutal crucible of combat medicine screamed at her. They were pushing the wrong fluids, applying pressure to the wrong areas. The chief and his senior surgeon, brilliant as they were seeing a textbook case, not the unique, perverse pathology she recognized from the raw, immediate lessons of the battlefield. They were exacerbating the very problem they sought to solve, flooding an already compromised system, making the tear worse, not better. Chief! Nizhoni's voice cut through the clamor of alarms and shouted commands, louder this time, edged with an urgency that bordered on insubordination. His peripheral perfusion is collapsing. The pressure point manipulation is incorrect. We're increasing proximal pressure, forcing more blood against the tear's expansion. Vargas snapped his head up, his eyes blazing, a flicker of pure terror warring with his ingrained arrogance. Nurse, I told you. We are following the guidelines. This is an aortic dissection. Do you understand the implications of what you're suggesting? You are questioning centuries of established medical practice. Sato, though silent, shot Nizhoni a withering glance. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her frustration mounting with every failing metric. She believed Vargas, she trusted the protocol, but the patient was dying in front of them, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced her resolve. But Omar didn't have the luxury of doubt. His breathing grew shallow, ragged. The monitor's relentless beat flattened into a long, agonizing wail. His eyes, fixed on some unseen point above, began to glaze over, the light of life dimming, preparing to extinguish. His body, once vibrant and full of music, began to sag, defeated. A cold, visceral fear gripped Nizhoni. This was the moment. The precipice. She had seen it countless times in the field, the point of no return where a life could either be snatched back from the abyss or irrevocably lost. The faces of comrades, of strangers, of children, flashed through her mind. She knew, with a terrifying certainty that bypassed all logic and protocol, that if she didn't act, Omar Hassan would die. And his death would be on her hands as much as theirs, for knowing the truth and failing to fight for it. "He's going into cardiac arrest," a resident yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Defibrillator. Get the paddles ready." Vargas roared, his voice cracking under the strain. He was fighting blindly now, throwing everything he had at a problem that refused to yield to his vast experience. But in his desperation, in his adherence to the right way, he was missing the only way. Nizhoni stepped forward, abandoning all pretense of deference. Her quiet, indigenous roots, her modest demeanor, were stripped away, replaced by the hardened resolve of a warrior. Her gaze locked onto Vargas, her eyes, usually downcast, now blazing with an intensity that brooked no argument. Omar was dying. And she was the only one who truly saw it coming. The chief, for all his brilliance, was about to let a young man die because he couldn't see past his own reflection in the gleaming steel of his instruments. The room descended into a frantic symphony of alarms, shouted commands, and the terrifying, escalating rhythm of a life fading away. Omar's chest movements became sporadic, then ceased entirely. The flat line hummed, a dirge for a life cut short. Nizhoni's quiet strength, dismissed by those in power, mirrors a universal feeling, the struggle of being overlooked. If you've ever felt unseen or championed the underdog, you know this journey. We love sharing stories where quiet heroes rise, and we warmly invite you to subscribe. Join our incredible global community of story lovers. Your support is vital. It helps us create even more compelling, high-quality narratives and connect with amazing people like you. Be part of our shared passion. We genuinely can't wait to welcome you. The flat line wasn't a sound, it was a tearing of the world itself. It ripped through the sterile air, shredding the last threads of hope, replacing the frantic symphony with an unbearable silence. Omar's chest, which moments ago had fought so valiantly, now lay still. The doctors, even Vargas, seemed to shrink, their practiced efficiency crumbling under the crushing weight of utter failure. The chief, who had never encountered a problem he couldn't conquer, stood frozen, the reflected light of the monitors glinting in the sudden, desolate emptiness of his eyes. For Nizhoni, it wasn't a silence. It was a roar. A primal, guttural scream from the depths of her memory, a sound she knew intimately from other bloody fields, other dying moments. It was the sound of a life slipping away, a sound that demanded a response beyond protocol, beyond fear, beyond consequence. In that instant, the quiet nurse vanished. Nizhoni, the deferential rookie, was extinguished by the searing heat of necessity. What remained was the combat medic. The warrior. The one who had learned to command chaos, to coax life back from the brink using nothing but instinct, ingenuity, and an unyielding will. A cold dread seized her first, the terror of being wrong, of overstepping, of the catastrophic fallout. Her career, her future, everything she'd quietly worked for, could evaporate in this single, audacious act. But the image of Omar, young and vibrant, a musician whose hands were meant for melody, not for the cold slab of the morgue, burned through the fear. The memory of the specific physiological shift, the one she'd witnessed in a dusty, bullet-ridden tent half a world away, screamed for action. It wasn't an option, it was a mandate. "He's not gone," Nizhoni's voice cut through the stunned silence, a low, resonant tone utterly devoid of her usual soft cadence. It wasn't a question, nor a plea. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute authority of someone who had stared death in the face and wrestled with it countless times. Her gaze, no longer timid, fixed on Vargas, burning through his shock. There's still a pulse, faint. The tear is collapsing a distal branch. I need to stabilize the pressure immediately, precisely. Now. Vargas blinked, his mind struggling to process the sudden shift in the young nurse before him. She was no longer just speaking, she was demanding. Nurse. Nizhoni, what are you talking about? His heart has stopped. We've lost him. No. The single word exploded from her, sharp and undeniable. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands were already moving. She pushed past a junior resident, ignoring his startled yelp. Her eyes scanned the room, identifying the precise tools she needed. Pressure points, precise counterperfusion. I need high-flow fluids, now. And a peripheral vasoconstrictor, stat. Dr. Sato, regaining a fraction of her composure, stepped forward, her face etched with furious disbelief. Nurse. What do you think you're doing? You are out of line. Stand down. But Nizhoni was already at Omar's side, her fingers flying with terrifying speed, palpating, searching, her touch no longer gentle but firm, purposeful, almost brutal. The quiet woman had been replaced by a force of nature. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, a soldier's breath before engagement. The raw fear of failure, the potential professional suicide, was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by the searing need to save this life. Every fiber of her being was concentrated on Omar, on the invisible enemy tearing him apart. The tear is expanding distally, she explained, her voice clipped, urgent. We need to create a rapid, localized pressure increase to counter the expansion and buy time for reperfusion. It's a last-ditch field technique for complex trauma, but it works. She didn't look up, her entire focus on the exact point on Omar's neck. She was now compressing with terrifying strength, her thumbs digging into soft tissue with the power of a vice. A gasp went through the room. They watched, transfixed, as the petite nurse applied a force that seemed impossible, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched. The procedure, described simply as pressure point/fluid technique in her proposal, was in practice a brutal, invasive application of sheer will and precise anatomical knowledge. This wasn't gentle nursing, this was controlled violence, designed to shock a dying body back to life. Vargas, despite his rigid adherence to protocol, despite the years of ingrained hierarchy, saw something in her eyes, and the fierce concentration etched on her face, that he had never witnessed before. He saw an absolute, unwavering certainty that transcended his own vast experience. He saw a conviction so pure, so desperate, that it defied logic. His own mind, analytical and precise, was still grappling with the mechanics, but his gut, that primal instinct that had guided him through countless impossible surgeries, screamed at him to listen. Fluids. High flow. Vasoconstrictor. Vargas's voice finally boomed, cutting through the stunned silence, echoing Nizhoni's command. His transformation was subtle but profound. He hadn't fully comprehended, but he had implicitly trusted. His own ego, his position, was for a fleeting moment secondary to the raw, undeniable force of her conviction. Nizhoni didn't even acknowledge the order. Her hands remained steady, unrelenting, working with an intensity that bordered on ferocity. She was in a different world, a combat zone where every second was life or death, where hesitation was betrayal. She pushed, she pressed, she willed the blood to go where it needed to go, to clot, to stabilize. Her own body trembled with the effort, but her eyes, wide and focused, never left Omar's pale face, searching for the smallest sign of life returning. The chief didn't see it coming, but now, he was watching it unfold. The sterile air of Sterling Medical, usually a sanctuary of controlled precision, now crackled with an almost primal energy. Vargas's booming affirmation of Nizhoni's command had been less an order and more a desperate, instinctive cry for salvation. He hadn't understood the why, but in her eyes, he'd seen the absolute certainty. And in that terrifying moment, certainty was all they had left. Nizhoni, however, wasn't thinking about Vargas or Sato, or even the rapidly collapsing hierarchy of the operating room. The world had shrunk to Omar, to the tearing vessel within him, and to her hands. Her body had shifted, imperceptibly at first, then with a sudden, stark transformation. The quiet, almost deferential rookie nurse vanished, replaced by a being of pure, unadulterated focus, a combat medic locked onto a mission. Her movements were economical, stripped of all extraneous flourish. She didn't wait for instruments, didn't consult a chart. With a swift, almost brutal efficiency, she positioned her body. Her left hand, strong and calloused, found a specific point on Omar's upper chest, just beneath his clavicle, pressing down with a force that made the gurney creak. Her right hand, equally resolute, landed on his abdomen, just below the sternum, digging in. This wasn't gentle palpation, it was a deliberate, almost violent compression. Her knuckles went white as she leaned into the boy, using her entire body weight, a shocking tableau in a space where delicate incisions and feather-light touches were the norm. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from disbelief and nascent horror. Dr. Sato, renowned for her unwavering composure, felt a jolt of something akin to revulsion. This was barbaric. Surgical repair was an art of precision, of minimizing trauma, of healing. What Nizhoni was doing looked like an assault. Sato's brilliant mind, accustomed to elegant solutions, struggled to reconcile this crude, forceful maneuver with any known medical practice. Her brow furrowed, a silent accusation forming in her eyes. Vargas, too, felt a chill crawl up his spine. His training screamed malpractice, screamed irreversible damage. He had given the order for fluids and vasoconstrictors, thinking Nizhoni would guide the team in their administration, not become a one-woman battering ram against a dying patient. He watched, aghast, as her muscles bunched, the veins in her neck standing out, her jaw set with an almost terrifying resolve. The pressure she was exerting was immense, enough to bruise, perhaps to fracture. His gut churned. Had he just condemned Omar with a moment of misplaced, desperate trust? But Nizhoni was oblivious to their internal turmoil. Her gaze was locked on Omar's face, then flicking to the monitors with an almost preternatural rhythm. Her breaths were shallow, controlled, a warrior's breathing before a charge. She was speaking, a low, guttural murmur that only Omar could hear, or perhaps only she herself. It sounded like an incantation, a plea, a command. "Stay with me, Omar. Fight. Just a little longer." The first sign was so subtle, so utterly outside the realm of expectation, that it was nearly missed. On the arterial line monitor, the erratic, terrifying plummet of Omar's blood pressure paused. Just for a flicker. Then, unbelievably, the number edged up by a single digit. Sato's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward, pushing aside a resident who was breathing too loudly. Her analytical mind, once dismissive, was now fully engaged, dissecting every micro-movement of Nizhoni's body, every subtle shift in Omar's pallor. She saw the Indigenous nurse adjust her stance, a slight tilt of her hips, changing the angle of pressure on Omar's chest, then her abdomen. It was like watching a sculptor manipulate clay, except the clay was a human body on the precipice of death. Vargas, whose heart had been hammering like a drum, felt a sudden, cold silence descend within his own chest. His eyes, trained over decades to spot the slightest deviation, registered it too. The blood pressure. The pulse, though still weak, had a fraction more form to it. It wasn't robust, not by a long shot, but it wasn't the chaotic, dying flutter of moments before. A breath caught in his throat. This wasn't science as he knew it. This wasn't surgery. This was something ancient, something born of sheer will and terrifying, unconventional knowledge. The chief didn't see it coming, didn't understand it, but he was watching life being wrestled back from the brink, one brutal, insistent press at a time. And in the eyes of the quiet rookie, he finally saw the ghost of every battlefield she had walked, every life she had refused to let go. Nizhoni's hands were no longer just pressing, they were guiding, a silent, forceful conversation with Omar's failing body. Each brutal press, each precise adjustment of her weight, was a syllable in a language only she seemed to understand. Her face, still set in that almost serene mask of concentration, betrayed nothing of the immense physical and mental toll. Sweat beaded on her forehead, catching the glare of the surgical lights, but her eyes remained locked on some unseen target beneath the young musician's skin, a landscape of trauma only her unique vision could navigate. Vargas, transfixed, saw the subtle dance continue. The chief, accustomed to the elegant, predictable movements of surgery, found himself utterly unprepared for this raw, visceral negotiation with death. He watched Nizhoni's shoulders flex, her core stabilize, her movements becoming less about sheer force and more about an almost surgical precision, a deep understanding of anatomy applied in a way he'd never witnessed. The flickering lines on the monitor, once a chaotic symphony of despair, were beginning to find a rhythm. It was faint, a whisper of a promise, but it was there. The chaotic flutter in Omar's pulse, which had been racing towards oblivion, softened, slowing just a fraction, gaining a minute, tenuous definition. Then, something shifted. A sigh, almost imperceptible, escaped Nizhoni's lips. Her posture, though still tense, seemed to ease just a fraction. Her hands, after one final, resolute press, held steady. The room, which had been holding its breath for what felt like an eternity, collectively exhaled a barely audible gasp. The monitors. The impossible was happening. The systolic pressure, after dipping dangerously low, began a slow, hesitant climb. The erratic spikes and drops in his pulse leveled out, forming a more coherent wave. It wasn't perfect, not yet stable, but it was a climb. It was a wave. It was life. Dr. Sato, who had been standing rigid, her initial skepticism curdling into a grim acceptance of the inevitable, took a stumbling step forward. Her brilliant mind, trained to dissect and repair, struggled to reconcile what it was seeing with everything it knew. Her eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, widened, mirroring the disbelief that rippled through the rest of the surgical team. A low murmur spread, a blend of awe and wonder. Junior nurses, their faces streaked with tears that had gone unnoticed moments before, gripped each other's arms, their silent pleas for Omar answered in this impossible turning of the tide. Vargas felt it most profoundly. The ice-cold knot of dread that had been tightening in his chest for the last hour suddenly, violently, unspooled. His heart, which had been a frantic drum, now settled into a deep, booming rhythm of its own, a rhythm of profound, overwhelming relief. He wasn't just observing a medical phenomenon, he was witnessing a resurrection. He looked at Omar, truly looked, and saw not just a dying patient, but a young man on the brink, pulled back by sheer, unconventional force. The pallor on Omar's face, though still stark, seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly, as if a flicker of warmth had returned. The chief of staff, the man who prided himself on control, on knowledge, on logic, found his throat tight, his vision blurring. This quiet rookie, this indigenous woman whose presence he had barely registered, had just done what his entire elite team, armed with the most advanced technology, could not. She had stared down death and wrestled a life back. He felt the sting of tears, hot and unexpected, behind his eyes. It was a release, a catharsis so deep it shook him to his core. The weight of his own hubris, his own dismissal, crashed down, then lifted, replaced by an incandescent, humbling gratitude. Nizhoni, her hand still precisely positioned, watched the monitors. Only when the numbers held steady, when the rhythm became undeniable, did she slowly, carefully, release her pressure. She stepped back, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion etched on her face. Her gaze, for the first time, met Vargas's. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so," only a quiet, deep-seated conviction that had held steady against the storm. Vargas could not speak. Words felt inadequate, clumsy, an insult to the profound miracle he had just witnessed. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate nod that conveyed more than any speech ever could. It was an acknowledgement, a validation, a silent apology, and a promise. Sato, for her part, could only stare, her mouth slightly agape, then she too nodded, a sharp, decisive movement that spoke volumes of her respect. The rigid hierarchy of Sterling Medical, for a breathtaking moment, dissolved into pure, unadulterated awe. The room thrummed with a new energy, a palpable shift from despair to exhilarating hope. Omar was not out of the woods, not yet. But he was alive. He had a chance. And it was all thanks to the chief not seeing coming the true depth of the rookie nurse's past, a past that had just rewritten the rules of possibility in his pristine, unyielding hospital. The air in the operating theater, thick moments ago with the stench of fear and the metallic tang of blood, now hummed with an almost reverent silence. The insistent, rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the cardiac monitor, once a death knell, was now the sweetest symphony. Omar's vitals had stabilized, the terrifying, cascading plummet had not just halted, but gently ascended. The aortic tear, moments from catastrophic rupture, held its ground, subdued by Nizhoni's radical, almost brutal, intervention. Dr. Mateo Vargas, chief of staff, a man whose every breath usually exuded unshakable confidence, looked utterly undone. His earlier nod, a quiet admission of error, now felt insufficient, a mere tremor before an earthquake. He pulled off his mask slowly, his gaze fixed on Nizhoni, then on the monitors, then back to her. The arrogance that had been a permanent fixture around him had evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked awe. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Nurse Nizhoni," he began, the formality a stark contrast to the informal rookie he'd internally used for weeks. What you just did, it was extraordinary. Impossible, by all our training." He glanced at Sato, who remained frozen, her surgical instruments still clutched in her gloved hands, her face a mask of profound disbelief and grudging respect. "We were watching him die. And you brought him back." Sato, usually so composed, finally moved, setting her instruments down with a soft click. She walked slowly to the monitor, scrutinizing the numbers. Her brilliant mind, accustomed to dissecting complex medical puzzles, struggled to reconcile what it had just witnessed with everything it knew. She turned to Nizhoni, her dark eyes piercing, but no longer dismissive. "The precision," Sato stated, her voice flat, devoid of its usual sharpness. "The immediate identification of that specific arterial vibration. I've never encountered a protocol, or a physiological marker, that would suggest such a technique." Where did you learn that?" The question hung in the air, echoing the unspoken thoughts of every scrub nurse, every anesthetist, every resident in the room. They had watched Nizhoni, this quiet, unassuming rookie, dismantle Sterling Medical's rigid protocols with a single, brutal, life-saving act. Nizhoni, however, seemed unmoved by the sudden spotlight. Her gaze was still on Omar, her expression serene, albeit etched with fatigue. She simply adjusted the fore-drip, her movements precise and economical. "He's stable for now," she said, her voice soft, focusing on the immediate medical need. "But we need to get him to bypass. And we have to monitor for any re-tearing." She wasn't seeking praise, she was still in medic mode, focused on the next step. Vargas stepped closer, a new light in his eyes, a hunger for understanding. "Nurse Nizhoni, with all due respect to the patient, we need to understand. What was that? How did you know? What is your background?" He wasn't asking for credentials to dismiss her anymore, he was asking to learn, to know. Nizhoni hesitated, her shoulders subtly tensing, a flicker of that hidden past crossing her features. It was not a past she typically shared, not in this pristine, sterile world. But the lives of others, and now Omar's, had always dictated her actions. She met Vargas's gaze, then Sato's, then swept her eyes across the faces of the stunned team, seeing not judgment, but genuine curiosity and nascent respect. "My name is Nizhoni. I was a combat medic," she said, her voice still quiet, but now imbued with an undeniable gravitas. "In the field, we learned to improvise. To recognize patterns in chaos. To use whatever we had to buy time when there was no time." She didn't elaborate on the brutal realities, the dirt, the screaming, the makeshift solutions born of desperation and genius. But the words painted a vivid picture for those who heard them. It wasn't just a job title, it was an identity forged in the crucible of extreme trauma, a relentless pursuit of life against impossible odds. Her quiet observation skills, her unshakable calm under pressure, her ability to see the human body as a dynamic, vulnerable system susceptible to subtle, life-saving interventions. These were not learned in a textbook or a sterile classroom. They were etched into her very being through raw experience. A collective murmur rippled through the theater. Combat medic. The word settled, recontextualizing everything. The unflinching gaze, the precise, brutal application of force, the absolute certainty in her actions, it all made sense. This wasn't a rookie nurse. This was a seasoned veteran, a warrior in a different uniform, who had simply been operating under the radar, her true capabilities hidden by humility and circumstance. Vargas nodded slowly, processing. A combat medic, he repeated, almost to himself, a slow smile dawning. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of profound admiration and a touch of something akin to relief. The hospital had just gained an invaluable asset, and he, as its chief, had nearly let his own ego cost them a life. Sato, too, nodded, a sharp, decisive motion that spoke volumes. The rigid hierarchy of Sterling Medical hadn't just dissolved, it had bent, adapted, and begun to reshape itself around the quiet, unassuming indigenous nurse who had just saved the day. Nizhoni, however, was already focused on the next phase of Omar's care, guiding the team with soft instructions, her past no longer a secret, but a quiet, powerful testament to who she was, a healer, a survivor, and now, undeniably, a hero. The weeks that followed Omar Hassan's miraculous stabilization were a testament to the fragile resilience of the human body and the profound impact of a single, decisive intervention. Omar, pulled back from the brink of a certain death, underwent a successful definitive surgical repair a few days later, his recovery slow but steady. The memory of the young nurse's face, etched with fierce conviction, was one of the first things he recalled, even before fully understanding the magnitude of what had transpired. He would later learn her name, Nizhoni, and the debt of gratitude he felt would weave itself into the very fabric of his music, adding layers of poignant depth to his compositions. His near-death experience hadn't just saved his life, it had deepened it, enriching his art and his perspective on the preciousness of every single breath. For Nizhoni, the change was immediate and profound. The quiet rookie nurse, who once meticulously faded into the background, now moved with a new, subtle authority. Her name, once whispered in hushed tones of incredulity, was now spoken with respect, even reverence. She no longer had to actively hide her past, it was out, and more than that, it was valued. Her indigenous background, once a silent undercurrent in a predominantly white institution, now felt like another facet of her unique strength, openly acknowledged and appreciated. She wasn't just a nurse anymore, she was Nizhoni, the one who saw what no one else could, the combat medic whose unconventional wisdom had saved a life. Her authentic self, previously confined to the shadows, had been fully illuminated, and the weight of that secrecy lifted, allowing her to stand taller, her purpose clearer than ever. She started actively participating in critical case reviews, her insights often providing a fresh perspective that the seasoned veterans had overlooked. Dr. Mateo Vargas, the once unassailable chief of staff, underwent the most public and transformative evolution. The humbling experience had cracked open his rigid worldview, allowing light to flood into areas previously darkened by ego. The initial shock gave way to deep introspection. He began to hold regular open-floor meetings, explicitly inviting junior staff, residents, and nurses to voice observations and concerns without fear of reprisal. He even implemented a Nizhoni protocol for rapid critical incident review, empowering nurses to immediately flag subtle physiological shifts they perceived as critical, ensuring their observations were taken seriously. Vargas's leadership shifted from autocratic pronouncements to collaborative inquiries. He made a conscious effort to mentor Nizhoni, not just as a nurse, but as a future leader, advocating for her to be placed on the rapid response team and pushing for her to develop training modules based on her unique experiences. His transformation wasn't about losing authority, but about wielding it with greater wisdom, humility, and a broadened understanding of where true expertise could reside. Dr. Akiko Sato, the brilliant but once dismissive senior surgeon, found her intellectual curiosity piqued in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Her initial skepticism had been pulverized by undeniable fact. She observed Nizhoni more closely, not as a junior, but as a fascinating medical mind. Sato began to seek out Nizhoni's input on complex cases, valuing her precise, observational acumen. Their exchanges, initially formal, grew into a professional respect that bordered on mentorship. Sato, known for her sharp intellect, recognized a kindred spirit in Nizhoni's unique problem-solving abilities. She became a vocal advocate for integrating diverse perspectives into medical teams, realizing that brilliance could manifest in many forms, and that the best outcomes often arose from a tapestry of knowledge rather than a single thread. The ripple effect permeated Sterling Medical Center. The doctors as gods culture didn't vanish overnight, but it began to erode. Open communication became not just encouraged but expected. The hospital started actively recruiting nurses and residents from diverse backgrounds, understanding that varied life experiences could lead to invaluable medical insights. Nizhoni's story became a legend, whispered in the halls, a constant reminder that true strength and innovation often arise from unexpected places. This wasn't just a story about a patient saved, it was a testament to human growth, the transformative power of humility, and the enduring hope that even the most rigid systems can bend towards progress when confronted with undeniable truth. Nizhoni, the quiet hero, continued her work, her hidden past now her most potent strength, inspiring a new era of collaborative medicine and reminding everyone at Sterling Medical that sometimes, the most profound wisdom comes from the voices we least expect to hear. The chief, humbled and enlightened, had finally seen what truly mattered, the immense, untapped potential in every single member of his team. Nizhoni's story beautifully illustrates that true wisdom and courage often bloom where we least expect them, challenging us to value every voice and perspective. What hidden potential do you think we overlook in our own communities? If this tale of resilience and transformation resonated with you, we warmly invite you to subscribe. Join our global community as we uncover more incredible narratives like Nizhoni's. Your support truly helps us create and share these powerful stories, enriching our collective journey. Thank you for watching, and for being such a valued part of our growing family.